The holiday card came in the mail on a Tuesday, and I was in it for exactly 1 inch. That was all they had left of me. 1 inch of gray cardigan sleeve, at the very edge of the frame, right where my grandson's hand had slipped on the crop tool. 41 years my wife had taken that photograph on our front porch. 41 years I had stood on the left, in the same spot, in the same light, with my hand on the porch rail. And now there were 300 of those cards, sitting in 300 mailboxes across this town, and in every single one of them I had been erased down to a sleeve. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I looked at that little gray sliver for a very long time. I did not shout. I did not call anyone. I did not even stand up. Then the phone rang. It was the bank, and the woman on the other end said, "Mr. Marsh, I need to verify the $310,000 you borrowed against your house last Thursday." I had not borrowed anything. Before I take you back to the beginning, do me one small favor. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I read every one of them, and it means more than you know. And if this story finds you, take a second to like it and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it keeps an old man talking. To understand how a bank came to call me about money I never borrowed, you have to go back to the first Thanksgiving after I buried my wife. My name is Theodore Marsh. I am 71 years old. I live at 42 Larkspur Lane in Brookfield, Pennsylvania, in a white house with green shutters that my wife and I bought in 1982 for $61,000 and paid off completely in 2004. I have lived in that house longer than most people in this town have been alive. I know which board on the porch creaks. I know that the third step sags a ½ inch in August and rises back up in February. I know the sound the storm door makes when someone comes home, and I know the different sound it makes when someone is only visiting. For 38 years, I was a bank examiner. Most people have absolutely no idea what that means. So let me tell you plainly. I worked for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is a bureau of the United States Treasury. My job was to walk into a bank, sit down at a desk that was not mine, and go through their books until I found the thing they did not want me to find. Not with a gun, not with a badge that anybody was scared of. With a pencil, a legal pad, and a truly monstrous amount of patience. I examined community banks in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. I examined a savings and loan in Altoona that had been quietly cooking its loan loss reserves for 6 years. I examined a trust department in Erie, where a vice president had been moving money out of dead clients' estates in amounts so small that nobody noticed until I laid 412 of them side by side on a conference table. He cried. He actually cried, and then he asked me how I saw it. I told him the truth. I told him that I did not look at the numbers. I looked at the edges. That is what a bank examiner really does. Anybody can read a ledger. The middle of a ledger is easy. The middle of a ledger is where the honest money lives. But the edges, the rounding, the reversals, the entries made at 4:58 on a Friday, the transaction that is $9,400 instead of $10,000, the edges are where people hide. Fraud is never loud. Fraud is quiet and small and boring, and it happens right at the border of the picture, where nobody is looking. 38 years. I retired in 2018, with a pension, a plaque, and a set of habits I could not put down if I tried. My wife was named Rosalind. She was the librarian at Brookfield Middle School for 40 years. 40 years in one room, with one desk, under a painted mural of a lion, because the Brookfield School mascot is the lions, and some art teacher in 1974 had covered the whole back wall with a big golden animal lying in tall grass with its eyes half open. Rosalind used to say that Lion was the best colleague she ever had. She said he never once talked during quiet reading. She knew every child in that building. Not most of them. Every single one. She knew who was hungry and who was faking sick to get out of gym, and who was reading 3 grade levels ahead and hiding it because it was easier to be ordinary. She kept a coffee can of granola bars in her bottom drawer for 22 years and never once told the front office about it. She was 5'1". She had a laugh that started as a wheeze. She could not parallel park to save her life, and she thought that was funny instead of embarrassing, which tells you almost everything about her. We had one son, Marcus. Marcus is 49 now. He was a soft, sweet boy who grew into a nervous man. He is not stupid, and he is not cruel, and I want you to hold on to that, because it is going to matter later. What Marcus is weak. Marcus wants very badly to be liked, and a man who wants to be liked more than he wants to be right will eventually be steered by whoever holds the wheel most firmly. The person holding the wheel was his wife, Priscilla. Priscilla Marsh is 46. She is an administrator at St. Bartholomew Regional Hospital, which means she does not treat patients, but she does decide things about patients, and she is extraordinarily good at it. She is polished. She is warm in a way that costs her nothing. She sends thank you notes. She remembers birthdays. She has the most beautiful handwriting I have ever seen on a human being, and she uses it like a weapon, and I mean that completely. I want to be honest with you, because there is no point in lying to strangers. I never liked her. Not from the first Sunday dinner in 1999, when she looked around our kitchen and asked, in the pleasantest possible voice, whether we had ever thought about what the house might be worth. She was 20. I let it go. Rosalind told me to let it go. They had 2 children, Ethan and Paige. Ethan is 24. He works at a digital agency in Philadelphia, doing motion graphics and video editing, which is a job that did not exist when I was his age, and which he is genuinely gifted at. When he was 9, he made a stop-motion film with his grandmother's paperclips and a flashlight, and it was so good that Rosalind kept it on her school computer and showed it to children for a decade. He was a beautiful, strange, quiet kid. He is not that anymore. Paige is 19. She is a sophomore at Penn State, studying communications, which she does not love, and she has her grandmother's laugh, which she does not know. She calls me on Sundays. She has called me on Sundays since she was 14 years old, and she has never once missed a Sunday. Not even the week she had mononucleosis. Not even the week she got her heart broken. Remember, Paige, she is the reason this story has an ending you can live with. Rosalind was diagnosed in the spring of 2024. Pancreatic, stage 3. The doctor was young, and he did it exactly right, which is to say he did not look away, and he did not lie, and I have thought about that man kindly ever since. She lived 11 months. I am not going to walk you through all of them, because they belong to me. But I will tell you 2 things about those 11 months, and I need you to remember both of them, because they are the hinges this entire story swings on. The first thing is that Rosalind refused a clinical trial. There was a second-line trial at a hospital in Philadelphia. It was a real chance. Not a great chance, but a real one. And in September, after we drove down there and sat in an office with a coordinator who was kind and businesslike, Rosalind said no. I asked her why. I asked her 3 separate times, across 2 weeks, and every time she gave me the same answer, in the same steady voice. She said, "Theo, I am not spending my last months on a highway." And I believed her. God forgive me, I believed her, because it sounded exactly like something she would say, and because a man will believe almost anything if the alternative is arguing with a dying woman he loves. The second thing is that on the 14th of January, 2025, in a hallway on the 4th floor of St. Bartholomew, Priscilla put a folder in my hands and a pen on top of it. Rosalind had just been readmitted. I had not slept in about 30 hours. I was standing under one of those fluorescent panels that hums at a frequency that makes you feel like your skull is full of bees. Priscilla said it gently, with her hand on my arm, and her voice was soft and full of concern. Dad, this is just in case. It is a durable power of attorney. If something happens to you while you are running back and forth to this hospital, somebody has to be able to sign for Mom's care. That is all it is. I want to tell you that I read it. I did not read it. I have read 10,000 documents in my life. I have found a forged endorsement on the back of a cashier's check by noticing that the ink sat wrong in the fibers. I once caught a bank president because he had initialed a correction with a fountain pen on a day the branch's own logs said he was in Bermuda, and I signed that folder in a hospital hallway without reading it, because my wife was dying 40 feet away, and my hands were shaking, and my daughter-in-law had her palm on my arm, and her voice was so kind. That is the thing nobody tells you about grief. It does not make you sad. Sad is manageable. Grief makes you obedient. Rosalind died on the 22nd of February, 2025, at 6:04 in the morning. I was holding her left hand. The nurse was named Adaize, and she was from Nigeria, and she stayed 20 minutes past the end of her shift because she did not want me to be in the room alone with the body of my wife. I have never forgotten her name. I never will. We buried Rosalind at Fairmount Cemetery on the 26th. 400 people came. 400. There were grown men in that church who had been failing readers in 1991, standing in the back in work jackets, crying like children. 4 days after the funeral, I installed a doorbell camera. I want to be clear about why. Because it matters. It was not suspicion. It was nothing so intelligent as that. It was that Paige had asked me to. She had read something about older people living alone, and she was 19, and scared, and she wanted a way to see that I was still walking in and out of my own front door. So I let a kid from the hardware store put a small black camera above my doorframe. It cost $189. It watches the porch. It watches the steps, and the rail, and the mailbox, and about 20 feet of my front walk. And it records audio. Nobody thought about that. Not Paige. Not me. Certainly not them. Now, the porch. In 1985, Rosalind decided that we were going to take a family photograph on the front porch every single Thanksgiving, and that it was going to be the same photograph from the same spot forever. She set the camera on the same fence post every year. She stood everybody in the same arrangement every year. I was always on the left, with my right hand on the porch rail. She did it in 1985, when Marcus was 8 and had a bowl haircut and a mustard stain. She did it in 1999, with Priscilla in it for the first time, brand new and radiant, and already looking at the house. She did it in 2002, with Ethan in her arms, 6 weeks old, screaming. She did it in 2020, on a freezing porch, in masks. 41 years. 41 photographs. They hang in the upstairs hallway in a double row, and if you walk from the bathroom to the bedroom, you can watch my hair go from brown to gray to white, and you can watch a little boy turn into a nervous man, and you can watch a woman 5'1" stay exactly the same until the year she is suddenly, terribly not. 2025 was the first Thanksgiving without her. I did not want to do it. Paige insisted. Paige set the camera on the fence post herself, and her hands were not steady, and she got the angle slightly wrong and did not care. I stood on the left, right hand on the rail. Gray cardigan, the one Rosalind bought me in 2019 at an outlet mall in Grove City for $22. We left Rosalind's chair on the porch, empty, with her red cardigan hanging on the back of it. Ethan took the photo file home to clean it up, because that is what Ethan does. He said he would fix the exposure and send everyone a copy, and I told him thank you, and I meant it, and I did not think about it again for 3 weeks. The card came on the 16th of December. It was a nice card, heavy stock, cream-colored. Priscilla's handwriting on the envelope, that beautiful handwriting, addressed to Mr. Theodore Marsh, 42 Larkspur Lane. She had mailed me a card with my own house on it, and on the front of that card was our porch, and there was Marcus, and there was Priscilla, and there was Ethan, and there was Paige, and there was Rosalind's empty chair, which they had kept because it was moving, because it played well. And on the far left edge of the frame, where the crop line fell, there was 1 inch of gray cardigan sleeve and the bottom half of a hand resting on a porch rail. My sleeve, my hand. I picked up the card and I held it under the kitchen light and I turned it slightly, the way you turn a document when you want to see whether the toner has cracked along a fold. And I thought, in a perfectly calm and professional way, the way I had thought 10,000 times in 38 years, somebody edited this. That was all. Not somebody hurt me. Not somebody betrayed me. Somebody edited this. Then I set it down, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table where my wife had sat for 43 years, and I did not drink the tea. I want to tell you what I felt, and I want to be honest, because there are people watching this who have felt it too, and they deserve to hear it said out loud by somebody their own age. I did not feel rage. Rage would have been a mercy. Rage is hot, and it moves, and it gives you something to do with your hands. What I felt was small. I felt like a piece of furniture that had been moved to the garage. I felt like a name that gets left off a list because the list was already long. I felt, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely and completely disposable. I am 71. I have carried caskets. I have testified before a Senate subcommittee. I have told a bank president to his face that his career was over. And I sat in my kitchen and looked at a Christmas card and felt like nothing at all. And then the telephone rang. The landline. The old one, on the wall, avocado green, that Rosalind refused to get rid of because she said you cannot slam a cell phone. I picked it up on the 3rd ring. The woman said, "Good afternoon. Is this Theodore Marsh?" Her voice was young and careful, and she was reading from a script. She said, "Mr. Marsh, my name is Denise Alvarado. I am calling from the Fraud Verification Department at Sentinel Trust Bank. I am required to verify a recent transaction on your account before we release the second disbursement." And I said, entirely without thinking, in a voice that sounded like an old man, "Verify what, dear?" She said, "Sir, I need to verify the home equity line of credit in the amount of $310,000, secured against the property at 42 Larkspur Lane, which closed on Thursday the 11th. I did not say anything. She said, "Sir? Mr. Marsh? Are you still there?" And there was a long silence on that phone line. And in that silence, I want you to understand exactly what was happening inside my head, because it was not shock, and it was not confusion. It was arithmetic. Because I know what a home equity line of credit is. I know how one gets originated. I know that the property has to be appraised, and the appraisal has to be ordered, and the title has to be pulled, and a lien has to be recorded at the county courthouse. I know that the closing has to be witnessed, and that the closing documents have to be signed, and that the signature on those closing documents has to be compared against a signature card that sits in a file at a branch. I know that all of that takes between 3 and 6 weeks. 3 weeks earlier, my grandson had cropped me out of a photograph, and I sat there with that avocado green receiver against my ear, and I did the only thing I have ever been any good at. I looked at the edges, Because a man does not get cropped out of a Christmas card by accident. A crop is a decision. A crop takes a hand, and a mouse, and a moment where somebody looks at the face of a 71-year-old man and drags a box around him and clicks. And a family does not borrow $310,000 against a house they do not own without a piece of paper that says they can. And I had signed a piece of paper. In a hallway, on the 14th of January, under a humming light, with a woman's hand on my arm. The two things were not two things. They were one thing. They were the same thing, done twice, 11 months apart, by the same people, and I had been sitting in the middle of it, like a man reading only the middle of a ledger, I said, into the phone, very slowly. And I made my voice sound uncertain, and old, and a little bit frightened, because that was the exact moment I decided what I was going to do. Miss Alvarado, I am sorry, dear. I do not think I understand any of this. And she said, in a voice that had gone suddenly, urgently careful, Mr. Marsh, sir, did you apply for this loan? And I want to be completely honest with you. I lied. I said, I do not know. I do not know, dear. My son handles all of that for me now. Since my wife passed, I get confused. And Denise Alvarado went very quiet on the other end of that line. And then she said something that told me everything I needed to know about her, and about what was really going on inside Sentinel Trust Bank. She said, very softly, almost a whisper, Mr. Marsh, please do not hang up. Because she had already known. She had already known before she dialed my number, and she had dialed it anyway. And she had dialed the landline instead of the cell number in the file. And that meant that somewhere in that bank there was a young woman who had found something at the edge of a ledger, and who had been told to leave it alone. I sat in my kitchen. I looked at the Christmas card with my own hand on it. And for the first time in 11 months, since the morning my wife stopped breathing at 6:04, I felt something in my chest that was not grief. It was interest. Professional interest. Rosalind used to say I was the slowest angry man she had ever met. She said I did not chase things. She said I sat down in the tall grass and waited until they came to the water. She had a name for it, when she was teasing me. I had not let myself think about it in a very long time. I looked at that card, and I picked up my pencil, and I turned it over, and on the back of a Christmas card that had my own house on it, and 1 inch of my own sleeve, I wrote the first line of a document that would eventually run to 211 pages. I wrote, December 16th, 1452. Call from D. Alvarado, Sentinel Trust, fraud verification. Hellock, 310,000, closed Thursday the 11th. And then I underlined the word closed, because a loan does not close by itself. Somebody at that bank had closed it, and I was going to find out who. That night, I did not sleep, and I did not pace, and I did not cry. I sat in my study, which used to be Rosalind's sewing room, and I put a legal pad on my knee, and I built a plan, the way I had built 100 examinations. An examination is not an accusation. That is the first thing they teach you. And it is the thing almost nobody understands. When you walk into a bank on a Monday morning, with your bag and your credentials, you do not walk in shouting. You walk in politely. You ask for a desk. You ask for coffee. You make yourself so boring, so slow, so utterly harmless, that within about 4 days, the entire staff forgets that you are there, and then you read everything. I had spent 38 years being underestimated on purpose. It was, in a very real sense, my professional specialty. So on the night of December 16th, at my own kitchen table, I made a decision that I have never regretted for 1 single second. They thought I was confused. I was going to be confused. I was going to be the most confused man in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I wrote 3 lines on that legal pad. I still have it. It is in a box in a lawyer's office, and it will be there long after I am gone. Line 1. They need me incapacitated. Find the paper that says so. Line 2. A loan leaves a trail. The trail is inside the bank. Get inside the bank. Line 3. Do not warn them. Do not accuse. Do not change one single thing about how you behave, because here is what I understood, sitting in that chair, that nobody else in this story understood. They were not finished. $310,000 against a house worth $610,000 is not the end of a plan. It is the beginning of one. You do not put a lien on a house you intend to leave standing. You put a lien on a house you intend to sell, because a home equity line is money you can take right now, quietly, without a buyer, and without a closing, and without anybody in the family finding out. $310,000 was the appetizer. The house was the meal. And I was the thing, sitting in the middle of the plate. So the very next morning, the 17th of December, at 9:15 in the morning, I did the first thing on my list. I drove to the Sentinel Trust branch on Delaware Avenue, and I walked in, and I asked to see a manager. Now let me tell you about that walk-in. I wore my worst coat. I wore my hearing aids, which I actually do not need in a quiet room, but which change the way a person looks at you within about 4 seconds. I brought a folded paper bag with things in it. I moved slowly, which was not hard, because my left knee has been telling me the weather since 2011. And when the young man at the greeter desk asked how he could help me today, I let a beat go by, one beat too long, and then I smiled at him vaguely, the way people smile when they have not quite heard. He raised his voice. They always raise their voice. I have watched people do this to my friends for years. I have watched a waitress lean down and speak to Rosalind like she was 4 years old. I have watched a car salesman shift his entire body language the moment he registered the white hair. The world hands you an enormous gift when it decides you are harmless. It hands you the ability to stand in a room and be furniture. They sat me in a glass office with a man named Wesley Hargrove. I want to describe Wesley Hargrove to you very precisely, because he is going to matter enormously, and because you have met him. He was 41. He had the kind of tan that a man does not get in Pennsylvania in December. He wore a lapel pin shaped like a small silver anchor, which is the Sentinel Trust logo, and he wore it slightly crooked, which told me he put it on in his car. He had a putter leaning in the corner of his office behind a plant. He had 3 framed photographs on the credenza, and in 2 of them, he was shaking hands with someone more important than himself. His title was Senior Private Client Advisor. That is not a real job. That is a sales job with a nice hat. And he had a picture on his desk. And in that picture, at a charity gala, in a ballroom, with a step and repeat banner behind them, standing 3 people over from Wesley Hargrove, with a glass of white wine in her hand, was Priscilla. I saw it in about 1.5 seconds, and I never looked at it again. I sat down across from him, and I set my paper bag on my lap. I said, my voice thin and pleasant, "Mr. Hargrove, I got a telephone call yesterday from a young lady at the bank, and I am afraid I did not understand a word of it." And Wesley Hargrove leaned back in his chair, and he laced his fingers behind his head, and he gave me the warmest, most enormous smile I have ever seen on a human face. He said, in a voice that was rich and easy, and absolutely reeking of relief, "Mr. Marsh, Ted, can I call you Ted? Honestly, sir, do not give that call a second thought. That was a clerical thing on our end. A verification bot, basically. It should never have gone out." He said, "Your family has this all completely handled. Your family has this all completely handled. I want you to sit with that sentence, because I have." I did not react. I let my mouth fall open just a little bit, the way it does when a man cannot follow a conversation, and I said, Oh, oh well. Marcus takes care of things now. Since Rosalind. And Wesley Hargrove said, with genuine warmth, "He sure does, Ted. You have got a great son." Then he stood up, and he came around the desk, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he walked me to the door of his own office, the way you walk a small dog out of a kitchen. And on the way out, at the door, in the friendliest possible tone, he said, "And listen, if the bank calls again, you just have Marcus give me a ring directly, all right? Do not you worry about any of it." There it was. Do not talk to the bank. Route it through Marcus. Route it through me. I shuffled out into the lobby of that branch, and I stopped, right in the middle of the floor, and I looked up, slowly, like a confused old man getting his bearings, and I counted the cameras. There were 6. 2 on the teller line, 1 over the vault door, 1 at the greeter desk, 1 in the corner, covering the ATM vestibule, and 1, a small dome, mounted directly above the door of Wesley Hargrove's glass office, angled down at the lobby. 6 cameras, 90-day retention, minimum, under their own internal policy, which I had personally reviewed when I examined a bank in this same holding company in 2009. And I had just walked into that branch, in my worst coat, with my hearing aids in, and gotten myself recorded on all 6 of them, standing in the lobby, on my own 2 feet, at 9:41 in the morning, alone, competent, unaccompanied, and asking questions about my own account. You want to know what I had in the folded paper bag on my lap? Nothing. There was nothing in that bag. It was an empty bag, and I had carried it into that branch for one reason, which is that a man carrying a paper bag with nothing in it looks like a man who has lost the thread of his own life. I got in my car. I drove 4 blocks. I parked behind the CVS, and I sat there, and I wrote for 11 minutes without stopping. Wesley Hargrove had made 3 mistakes in 8 minutes, and he did not know about a single one of them. The first mistake was that he had known who I was. He had not looked me up. He had not asked for identification. He had not pulled the account. He had known my name and my son's name and my dead wife's name before I finished my first sentence, which meant Wesley Hargrove had been briefed. The second mistake was that he told me the fraud verification call was a clerical error. It was not. A fraud verification hold does not fire on its own, and it cannot be cleared by a private client advisor. It is cleared by the fraud department, which meant that somewhere in that bank, Denise Alvarado's flag was still open, and Wesley Hargrove was lying about a control he did not have the authority to touch. And the third mistake, the one that ended him, was the anchor pin, and the putter, and the photograph on the credenza. Because Wesley Hargrove was a man who wanted to be seen as important, and a man who wants to be seen as important documents everything he does. Now I am going to tell you about the letter. On the 18th of December, I went to the UPS store on Route 10, and I opened a private mailbox in my own name, and I paid for 18 months of it in cash. $240. The girl behind the counter was maybe 20, and she was very kind to me, and she asked if I needed help filling out the form, and I said yes, please, dear, and I let her do it, and I watched her write my own name in her handwriting. Then I went home, and I sat down at Rosalind's sewing table, and I wrote a letter to Sentinel Trust Bank. I did not write it as an angry man. I did not write it as a victim. I wrote it as an examiner. I want to read you part of it, because it is the single most important piece of paper in this entire story, and it is 4 sentences long. It said, "To the compliance officer, Sentinel Trust Bank. Pursuant to my rights as the account holder of record on the property at 42 Larkspur Lane, Brookfield, Pennsylvania, I am requesting a complete copy of the origination file for the home equity line of credit, referenced as closing, on December 11th, including the appraisal, the title report, the signature card comparison, the closing documents, and the identity of every employee whose credentials appear in the audit log for that file. I did not apply for this loan. I have never applied for this loan. Please preserve all records, including telephone recordings, relating to this account and to any communication with any member of my family, and be advised that I am providing a copy of this letter to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. I mailed it certified, return receipt requested, on the 19th of December. Now listen to me very carefully, because this is the part that people miss. I did not mail that letter because I expected an answer. I mailed that letter because a certified letter creates a legal obligation. The moment a bank receives written notice that a customer disputes a transaction and requests preservation of records, that bank is on a document hold. It cannot delete. It cannot overwrite. It cannot let a 90-day camera retention cycle quietly roll over. Every telephone recording, every keystroke log, every email, every internal chat message becomes frozen in amber, and if one single byte of it goes missing, that is not a family dispute anymore. That is obstruction, and it is federal, and it will end the career of every person who touched it. I did not need Sentinel Trust to help me. I only needed Sentinel Trust to stop being able to destroy anything. And the truly beautiful part, the part that I have thought about many times since, is this. Wesley Hargrove would have received a copy of that letter. He would have read it. And he would have understood, in his gut, that the walls had just been poured in concrete, and he could not tell Priscilla, because the moment he told Priscilla, Priscilla would know that the confused old man in the worst coat was not confused. So Wesley Hargrove sat on it. He sat on that letter, and he sweated, and he told himself he would handle it, and he did not tell a single living soul, which meant that from the 19th of December onward, the 4 people conspiring against me were no longer conspiring with the same information. That is how you take a group apart. You do not attack it. You simply let one member of it have a secret. The receipt came back on the 23rd, signed for by someone named T. Okafor, compliance, 9:41 a.m. I put it in a folder. 3 days later, on the 26th of December, the day after Christmas, Denise Alvarado called me for the second time. She did not call from the bank. She called from a cell phone, and she called at 7:50 in the evening, and I could hear a television somewhere behind her, and a child asking about juice. She said, "Mr. Marsh, I am not supposed to be doing this." Her voice was shaking. Not a little, genuinely shaking. She said, "I got moved. They moved me off the queue. They put me on outbound collections, which is not my job, and my manager told me it was a coverage thing, but I have been at this bank for 14 months, and it is not a coverage thing." And she said, "And I will remember this until the day I die. Mr. Marsh, I have a daughter, and I have $11,000 in student loans, and I cannot lose this job. But I opened your file before they locked me out, and I looked at the signature card." And she stopped. And I said, very gently, into that avocado green telephone, "Denise, tell me what you saw." And she said, in a whisper, "The signature on the closing package does not match. It is not even close. And the identity verification photo in the file is not a photograph of you." I closed my eyes. I said, "What is it a photograph of?" And Denise Alvarado said, "It is a family photo. It is a Christmas card." I stood in my kitchen for a moment. I want to be truthful. My hand was completely steady on the receiver, and the rest of me was not. They had used the card. They had needed a household verification document, a photograph, an address confirmation, a piece of paper that said, "This is who lives at 42 Larkspur Lane," and they had used the Christmas card, and they had used the version with me cropped out of it, because a bank employee flipping through a file cannot ask a question about a man he cannot see. They had not cropped me out of the picture because they were cruel. They had cropped me out of the picture because I was evidence. I opened my eyes. I said, "Denise, listen to me very carefully, because I am going to tell you exactly what you are going to do, and I want you to understand that not one single part of it is brave." She said, "What?" I said, "You are not going to leak anything to me. You are not going to send me a document. You are not going to break one rule at that bank, because if you do, they will fire you for cause, and then every true thing you say will be the word of a disgruntled employee, and it will be worth absolutely nothing." I said, "You are going to be procedural." And I told her. I told her that Sentinel Trust, like every insured depository institution in this country, has a written policy on suspected elder financial exploitation. I told her that policy is not optional, and it is not a suggestion, and it is not something a senior private client advisor gets to override, because it exists to satisfy federal examiners, and it has a form. I told her to fill out the form. I told her to submit an internal escalation to the Bank Secrecy Act officer, in writing, in the system, with a timestamp, describing exactly what she had observed, using no adjectives whatsoever, citing only the signature card mismatch and the identity document anomaly and the customer's verbal statement of non-application on December 16th at 14:52. And then I told her the part she did not expect. I said, "Denise, when you file it, do not hide it. Copy your manager. Copy Wesley Hargrove." And she said, appalled, "Why would I copy Wesley?" And I said, "Because a man who is stealing cannot afford to receive a document that proves he was told." Silence on the line. Long silence. And then Denise Alvarado, 29 years old, 14 months into her first real job, with a daughter and $11,000 of debt, said, in a completely different voice, "I filed the escalation at 4:40 on the 23rd. I copied everyone. I did it before I called you." I sat down on my kitchen chair. Sometimes you get very lucky. Sometimes the world hands you a young person who does not need to be taught courage, because she has been quietly carrying it around the entire time, waiting for somebody to tell her that it was allowed. I said, "Denise." She said, "Yeah?" I said, "You have just done something enormously important, and I need you to write down the date and the time you filed it, and put it somewhere that is not at that bank, and then go to bed and stop worrying about it, because from this moment forward it is not your problem, it is theirs." And then I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen, 71 years old, in a house with a lien on it that I never signed for, and I said out loud, to nobody, in an empty room, to a woman who had been dead for 10 months, "Rose, they used your porch." On the 2nd of January, I went to see a lawyer, not the family lawyer. The family lawyer was a man named Doug Prentice, who had done our will in 1994, and who golfed, occasionally, with people who golfed with Wesley Hargrove. Brookfield is not a big town. In a town this size, a secret is just a piece of information that has not been bored yet. So I drove 40 minutes to Allentown, and I walked into a small office above a dry cleaner, and I sat down across from a woman named Elena Cruz. Elena Cruz is 53 years old. She practices elder law and financial exploitation, which is a specialty that did not exist when I started my career, and which now, God help us, has a waiting list. Her office had a window air conditioner in January, and a stack of banker's boxes that came up to my shoulder, and on the wall behind her there was a framed photograph of a woman in her 90s holding a set of house keys and laughing so hard her eyes were shut. I asked about the photograph. Elena Cruz said, without any expression at all, "That is Mrs. Ferraro. Her nephew sold her house out from under her while she was in rehab for a broken hip. It took me 2 years. That is the day she got it back." Then she said, "Mr. Marsh, tell me what happened, and start at the part where you signed something." I liked her immediately. I put everything on her desk. the Christmas card, the legal pad, the certified mail receipt signed by T. Okafor, 14 pages of notes, all of them dated and timed, because 38 years of examination reports do not leave a man just because he retired. She read for 22 minutes without speaking. 22 minutes. I sat there, and I listened to that window unit rattle, and I watched a woman read. Then she put the pages down, and she looked up, and she said something I was not prepared for. She said, "Mr. Marsh, the loan is not the crime." I said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "The loan is a symptom. Look at your own notes. You signed a durable power of attorney in a hospital hallway on January 14th, 2025. Your wife died on February 22nd. The loan closed on December 11th. That is 11 months. Why would somebody wait 11 months?" And she leaned forward, and she tapped the legal pad with one finger. She said, "They waited because the power of attorney you signed was not effective yet." I felt the floor tilt a very small amount. She said, "There are two kinds. An immediate durable power of attorney is live from the day you sign it. A springing durable power of attorney does not activate until a specific condition is met. And in Pennsylvania, that condition is almost always the same. It springs when a physician certifies in writing that the principal is incapacitated." She said, "Mr. Marsh, if they closed that loan on December 11th, then somewhere there is a doctor's letter dated before December 11th that says you are not competent to manage your own affairs." And I sat in that little office, above a dry cleaner, and I understood, all at once and completely, what had actually been done to me. Everything I had thought was grief was a construction project. They had not simply taken money. They had spent 11 months building a man, a paper man, a confused, declining, withdrawn, unsafe old man named Theodore Marsh, who lived at 42 Larkspur Lane and could not be trusted with his own name. And they had built him out of small things, out of tiny, deniable, boring things, none of which meant anything alone, out of edges. I said, out loud, in that office, "Miss Cruz, I need to go home and look at my house." She said, "Look at it how?" And I said, "The way I would look at a bank. I want to tell you what I found. And I want you to understand that I found it in a single afternoon, on the 3rd of January, because I finally stopped looking at my life like a widower and started looking at it like an examiner." Item 1. My car keys. Since October, my car keys had moved. Not once, repeatedly. I keep my keys on a brass hook by the back door, and I have kept them there since 1982, and in October they started turning up in strange places, in the bread drawer, on the bathroom windowsill, once, memorably, in the freezer, in a bag of peas, and every single time, somebody had been there to find them with me. Priscilla, on a Sunday, with her hand on her chest, saying, in a voice full of the gentlest possible alarm, "Oh, Dad! Oh, honey! In the freezer?" Marcus, standing behind her, not saying anything. I had apologized. I had actually apologized. I had stood in my own kitchen and apologized to my son and his wife for something I did not do. Item 2. The stove. On the 4th of November, Priscilla arrived at my house at 11 in the morning and found the front left burner turned on under an empty pot. She turned it off. She made a very small sound in her throat. She did not shout at me, and she did not scold me. And that was the thing I should have caught. Because Priscilla scolds. Priscilla scolds waiters. Priscilla scolds pharmacists. She did not scold me. She was gentle. Gentle is what you are when you are collecting. I do not use the front left burner. I have not used the front left burner since 2021. Because the igniter clicks and it drives me insane. I use the back right. Ask anybody who has ever eaten in my kitchen. Item 3. The wellness check. On the 19th of November, at 6:40 in the evening, a Brookfield police officer knocked on my door. He was polite and young, and clearly embarrassed. He said they had received a call about an elderly male, possibly wandering near the intersection of Larkspur and 9th. I told him I had been home since 3. He said, "Yes, sir. That is what I figured. Sorry to bother you, sir." And then he said the thing that he did not know was a gift. He said, "Well, at least it went in the log. Family called it in. They just want to know you are safe. It went in the log. That is what they were building. A log, a record, a trail of official, documented, time-stamped little moments that add up, in front of a judge, into a picture of a man who cannot be left alone." Item 4. And this is the one that made me sit down on the stairs. The interior camera. In September, Ethan had come over on a Saturday, with a small white box and a very kind face. He said, "Pop, Paige worries." He said, "It is just so somebody can check in on you." He said, "I will set the whole thing up. You do not have to touch anything." And he put a small white camera on the bookshelf in my living room, angled to cover the whole room, and he set it up on his own account, on his own phone, with his own password. I had said thank you. I had made him a sandwich. I sat on my stairs on the 3rd of January, and I looked across the hall at that little white camera on my own bookshelf, and I understood that for 4 months I had been living inside somebody else's surveillance operation, and I had made the man who installed it a turkey sandwich with mustard. Now, here is where a lot of people would have ripped that camera off the shelf and thrown it in the driveway. I did not. I went and got a chair and a flashlight, and I spent 1 hour and 40 minutes in my own living room, finding out exactly what that camera could and could not see. I found 4 things. It could see the sofa, the coffee table, the fireplace, and the front window. It could not see the corner behind the door, where the coat rack is. It could not see the bottom 4 steps of the staircase. It could not see the dining room, because the doorway cuts the angle. And its microphone, which was a very cheap microphone, in a very cheap plastic housing, could not pick up a normal speaking voice from the kitchen, because the kitchen is around a corner, and through a swinging door, and my house was built in 1938, when they still made walls out of plaster and horsehair. So from the 3rd of January onward, I lived in my house in 2 different ways. In the living room, I was old. In the living room, I sat on the sofa in a cardigan, and I watched television with the volume too loud, and I fell asleep at 8 o'clock with my mouth open. In the living room, I dropped things. In the living room, I stood up and then stood there for a second, like I had forgotten why. In the living room, once, I called my own son by my brother's name, and I saw his face, and I saw him make a note. In the living room, I gave them everything they wanted. And in the kitchen, and in the study, and in Rosalind's sewing room with the door shut, I was Theodore Marsh, 38 years, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and I was building a case. I want to talk to you about that, because I know how it sounds. There are people watching this who are going to say that a man should confront his family, that a man should stand up in his own living room and say, "I know what you are doing, and I will not have it." And I understand that. I do. It is a good instinct, and it comes from a good place. But let me tell you what happens when you do that. You warn them. You warn them, and they take the doctor's letter and the power of attorney, and they file an emergency petition, and in 9 days you are sitting in a facility in a room with a vinyl mattress, and a judge you have never met has given your son the legal authority to decide where your body goes and what your money does. And every single thing you say after that, every reasonable, articulate, furious sentence will be entered into the record as agitation. There is no argument you can win from inside that room. There is no explanation. The moment you are declared incapacitated, your voice stops being evidence and starts being a symptom. You cannot fight that in a living room. You can only fight it with paper. And to get paper, you need time. And to get time, you need them to believe, right up until the very last possible second, that they have already won. Rosalind understood this about me long before I did. She used to sit in that green chair by the window and watch me not react to things. She watched me not react when my brother told me at our mother's funeral that he was taking the house. She watched me not react in 1996 when a man at the OCC took credit for 4 months of my work in front of a room full of people. She said to me once, and she was half laughing when she said it, "Theo," other men shout, "you just go quiet, and you sit down in the grass, and you wait. And then 8 months later, somebody's whole life falls over, and nobody can figure out why." She said, "You are not a dog, my love. You do not chase." And she put her book down, and she looked at me over the top of her glasses, and she said the thing she called me when she was in a particular mood, the thing I had not let myself remember in almost a year. She said, "You are an old lion." I sat on the stairs of my house on the 3rd of January, 71 years old, and I did not cry. I went to get a notebook. Now, I need to tell you about the caregiver journal, because this is the single most frightening object I have ever held in my hands, and I have held forged bank records. On the 11th of January, Priscilla left her purse on my kitchen counter for 11 minutes while she went upstairs to, in her words, check on the guest room. There is no guest room. There is Marcus's old bedroom, and there is a room with boxes in it. She was upstairs looking at my house, and in the 11 minutes she was gone, I did something I had never in my life done to another human being. I opened her handbag, and inside it was a composition notebook. The kind with the marbled black and white cover, the kind Rosalind used to hand out by the case at the middle school. And on the front, in Priscilla's beautiful, elegant, terrible handwriting, it said, T. Marsh, Care Notes. I opened it. There were 61 entries, 61 dated, timed, handwritten entries, going back to the 2nd of March, 2025, 8 days after I buried my wife. 8 days. I want to read some of them to you. I photographed every page with my telephone, standing at my own kitchen counter, listening to her footsteps on the ceiling, and I have read them so many times since that I know them by heart. March 2nd. Dad seems confused about the funeral timeline. Asked twice when the service was. Very low affect. March 19th. Dad left the front door unlocked. 2nd time this month. April 6th. Dad called me Rosalind, corrected himself, but appeared distressed. June 22nd. Dad was unable to locate his own bank statements when asked. Became defensive. August 15th. Dad has stopped attending church. Increasing social isolation. October 9th. Dad could not recall the day of the week. Repeated question 3 times. November 4th. Found front burner on under empty pot. Dad had no memory of turning it on. Serious safety concern. Discussed with Marcus. November 19th. Wellness check requested. After Dad was observed disoriented outside the home. Officer responded. Documented. November 27th. Thanksgiving. Dad did not participate in the family photograph. Withdrew to the house. Did not speak to grandchildren. I stood in my kitchen, and I read that last entry 4 times. I did not participate in the family photograph. I was in the family photograph. I was in it with my hand on the porch rail, in a $22 cardigan, and there is 1 inch of me still visible on 300 greeting cards in this town. And she had written, in ink, in a notebook, 8 days after my wife's funeral, and continuing for 10 months, a complete and total fiction of my decline. And every entry, every single one, was either an event she had staged herself, or an ordinary human moment described in clinical language, or a flat, outright lie. Do you understand what I was holding? I was holding the reason, not the reason they wanted my money. Anybody can want money. I was holding the reason they had to erase me from a photograph. Because a caregiver journal is not a diary. A caregiver journal is an exhibit. It is the kind of document that gets handed to a physician and to a judge, and it carries a weight that is almost impossible to fight because it is contemporaneous. It was written at the time. Judges love contemporaneous, and the photograph was the proof. You cannot write in a notebook that a man has withdrawn from his family and then hand a judge a picture of that man standing on the porch with his family. The photograph would have killed the story, so the photograph had to be adjusted. They did not crop me out of a Christmas card. They cropped me out of the evidence. I heard the floorboard at the top of the stairs, the one that creaks, the one that has creaked since 1938. I put the notebook back in her handbag. I straightened the strap the way it had been, and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I picked up a crossword puzzle that I had already finished 4 days earlier, and I stared at it with a pen in my hand. Priscilla came down the stairs. She stood in the doorway of my kitchen, and she looked at me for a second, and then she smiled her beautiful warm smile, and she said, in a voice as soft as a blanket, "Dad, are you stuck?" And I looked up at her, and I let my eyes go slightly unfocused, and I said, 9 across. I cannot get it. I have been at it all morning. She came over. She looked down at the puzzle. She patted my shoulder twice. She said, gently, sadly, in a tone of pure and perfect compassion, "Oh, Dad, it is already filled in." And she picked up her handbag, and she left, and I sat there. And I want to tell you exactly what I did next, because it is the truest thing in this entire story. I finished the crossword. 9 across was patience. It was already written in. On the 16th of January, a doctor came to my house. I need you to hear this part carefully, because if you take one single practical thing away from this entire story, let it be this one. He was there for 12 minutes. His name was Alan Halloran. He was 63 years old. He wore a very good overcoat, and he carried a leather portfolio, and he had the confident, pleasant, slightly bored manner of a man who has been the smartest person in a lot of rooms and stopped checking a while ago. Priscilla brought him. Of course she did. Priscilla is an administrator at St. Bartholomew Regional Hospital, and Dr. Alan Halloran had privileges at St. Bartholomew Regional Hospital, and Priscilla was on the committee that approved the renewal of those privileges. And I did not know any of that on the 16th of January, but I knew all of it by the 4th of March, she said brightly, as she took his coat. "Dad, this is Dr. Halloran. He is a friend. He just wants to say hello. He just wants to say hello." He sat in my living room, in the camera's field of view, incidentally, which I noticed within about 4 seconds, and which I have thought about with enormous satisfaction ever since. He asked me what day it was. I told him, correctly. He asked me who the president was. I told him, correctly. He asked me to remember 3 words: apple, table, penny. He asked me to count backwards from 100 by 7s. I got to 72, and then I stopped, and I looked out the window, and I let my mouth go a little slack, and I said, "Rose, is that the mailman?" Priscilla made a small sound. Dr. Halloran wrote something down. He never asked me to remember the 3 words. I want you to understand what that means. The 3-word recall is the entire point of that portion of the examination. You give the patient 3 words, you distract them with a task, and then you ask them to repeat the words back. That is the test. That is the only reason the words exist. He gave me the words, he distracted me, and then he closed his portfolio. He never asked for them back. Because he was not testing me. He was not there to find out anything. He had arrived at my house with the conclusion already written, and the 12 minutes were the paperwork. He did not take my blood pressure. He did not look at my medication list. He did not ask me a single question about my history, my mood, my sleep, my appetite, my finances, or my wife. He did not order any imaging. He did not consult my actual physician, a man named Roy Sandoval, whom I have seen twice a year, since 2006, and who would have thrown him out of the building. He stood up. He shook my hand. His hand was soft. He said, warmly, "Mr. Marsh, it was a real pleasure." And then he went out onto my porch with Priscilla, and he pulled the door most of the way shut behind him, and he stood on the top step in his very good overcoat, and the doorbell camera above my door recorded 71 seconds of him. 71 seconds, in which Dr. Alan Halloran, who had spent 12 minutes in the presence of a man he had never met before, said this. He said, in a low, easy, businesslike voice, "That is straightforward. I can have the certification to you by Friday." And Priscilla said, in a voice I had never heard her use, a voice with no warmth in it at all, a voice like a door closing, "Friday is too late. Wesley needs it Wednesday." And Dr. Halloran laughed. He laughed. He said, "All right, Wednesday. Send me the intake sheet, and I will match the language. Send me the intake sheet, and I will match the language." He was asking her what to write. He was asking the woman who had spent 10 months forging a notebook to tell him what his own medical opinion should say. And I was standing 4 feet away, on the other side of my own front door, in a cardigan, with a hand on the frame, listening. The camera recorded all of it, in 180 pixels of gray January light, with a timestamp burned into the corner of the frame, at 11:52 in the morning, on the 16th of January, 2026. I have watched it more than 100 times. I have never once gotten used to the laugh. That night, I did something I had been putting off for 3 weeks. I went into Rosalind's sewing room, and I sat down, and I wrote a letter to a man named Frank Delgado. Frank Delgado came to work for me in 1999. He was 26 years old, and he had a degree from Rutgers, and an accent from Newark, and a suit that did not fit him. He was terrified of me for about 6 weeks, and then he was not, and then he was the best examiner I ever trained. He is 53 now. He is a deputy comptroller at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which means that when Frank Delgado picks up a telephone, banks stop what they are doing. We speak maybe twice a year. He sent flowers when Rosalind died. He wrote by hand. I did not call him. I want to be very precise about that, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not call Frank Delgado and ask him for a favor. If I had done that, if I had used a personal relationship to trigger a federal action, every single thing that came out of it would have been contaminated. A defense attorney would have stood up in a courtroom and said the word vendetta, and he would have been right, and it would have worked. So I did not ask. I built a package. I built it the way I would have built a referral in 1994. Cover memo, chronology, exhibits, tabbed and numbered. No adjectives, no opinions, no emotion of any kind whatsoever. Just facts, in order, with dates and times, each one sourced, each one independently verifiable by a person who had never met me and did not care about me. Exhibit A, the certified letter of December 19th, and the signed return receipt. Exhibit B, my contemporaneous note of the fraud verification call, December 16th, 1452. Exhibit C, the Christmas card, both versions. I had found the original file on Ethan's shared drive, because Ethan had shared that drive with the entire family in 2022 to distribute vacation photographs, and had never once thought about it again. The original, uncropped, with the metadata intact, camera model, date taken, and the edited version, exported on the 4th of December at 11:19 at night from a program called Adobe Photoshop, on a machine registered to Ethan Marsh. Exhibit D, 61 photographs of a composition notebook. Exhibit E, 71 seconds of video from a doorbell camera. And on the cover memo, above all of it, I wrote one sentence. 1. I typed it, and I looked at it, and I did not change a word. It said, "There is a bank in Pennsylvania that requires a routine examination. That is all." I mailed it on the 17th of January to Frank Delgado at the office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Northeastern District. And then I drove home, and I made a can of soup, and I went to bed, and I slept for 9 hours, which was the first real sleep I had gotten since my wife died, because I had done my job. An examiner does not decide. An examiner does not prosecute. An examiner does not get angry. An examiner documents, and then he hands it up. Frank Delgado called me on the 26th of January. He did not say hello. He said, "Ted," and I said, "Frank." And there was a long pause, and then he said, in a voice that I had never heard from him in 27 years, a voice that was doing something complicated, "Ted, is this about you?" And I said, "Yes." And he was quiet for a while. And then Frank Delgado said, very carefully, "Ted, I want you to understand something. If I open this, I cannot control what it does. It goes to the Bank Secrecy Act unit. It goes to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. If the numbers are what your chronology says they are, it goes to the Bureau. And once it is in the machine, it does not care that it is your son." And I sat in my kitchen, in the chair where my wife used to sit, and I looked out the window at the porch. And I said, "Frank, I have been sitting in this house for 11 months, telling myself that my son is weak, but he is not a criminal." I said, "On the 16th of January, a doctor stood on my front steps and asked my daughter-in-law what to write in his medical opinion of me. And my son's car was in the driveway. And I said, 'Open it.' And Frank Delgado said, 'All right.' And then he said one more thing, and I have never told anybody this before, and I am telling all of you now, because I think it is the only part of this that is really about anything. He said, 'Ted, in '99, you told me something on my 3rd week. Do you remember?' I said no. He said, 'You told me that most fraud is not committed by monsters. You said most fraud is committed by ordinary people who told themselves a story about why they were owed something. And you said the job is not to hate them. You said the job is to write it down accurately, because accuracy is the only kindness that survives.' And he said, 'I have said that sentence to every examiner I have ever trained.' And then he hung up, and the machine started. Now, I have to tell you about Paige. Paige called me on Sunday, the 1st of February. The way she has called me every Sunday since she was 14, and she did not talk about school, and she did not laugh. And after about 6 minutes of nothing, she said, 'Pop, can I come see you?' And I said, 'Of course, sweetheart. When?' And she said, 'I am in your driveway.' She had driven 2 hours and 40 minutes from State College, on a Sunday, in January, in a 9-year-old Corolla with a bad heater, and she had not told anybody, and she was sitting in my driveway with the engine running, because she did not have the courage to knock. I met her at the door. She was 19 years old, and her face was blotched, and she had been crying in a car for a while. I took her into the kitchen, not the living room, the kitchen, around the corner, through the swinging door, in a house built in 1938, out of plaster and horsehair. I made her tea. She did not drink it. Neither of us ever drinks the tea. It is a thing to do with your hands. And Paige Marsh said, 'Pop, I think there is something wrong with my family.' And then she put her phone on my kitchen table. She said, 'Ethan left his laptop open at Christmas.' I was not snooping. I was looking for the photos from the beach thing. And there was a folder. She said, the folder was called Marsh, Support, and she played me a video. It was 38 seconds long. It was me, in my living room, Sitting on the sofa, somebody off camera says, "Pop, who is this?" And a hand comes into frame, holding up a photograph. And in the video, I look at the photograph, and I look confused, and I say, "I do not know. I do not know." And then it cuts. And Paige said, her voice absolutely shaking, "Pop, that is you saying you do not recognize Ethan. That is what it looks like. That is what it looks like to anybody." And I sat there, and I looked at that video for a long time. And then I said, "Sweetheart, play it again." She played it again. And I said, "Paige, watch the window behind my head." She watched. I said, "In the first half of that video, there is snow on that window ledge. In the second half, there is not." I said, "That is 2 videos." She stared at me. I said, "In the first video, somebody held up a photograph and asked me who it was, and I will tell you exactly when that happened, because I remember it. That was the 28th of December, and Ethan was holding up a photograph of a class picture from 1963, and it was your great-grandmother's 3rd grade class, and I did not know who any of them were, because I was not born until 1955. I said, "He asked me to identify a stranger, and I said I do not know, and he kept it." And Paige Marsh put both her hands flat on my kitchen table, and she said, in a very small voice, "Why would he do that?" And I said, "Because somebody asked him to." And she started to cry, and she was 19, and she was in her grandmother's kitchen, and I let her. And when she was finished, she wiped her face and she looked at me, and she said the thing that I have carried with me ever since, the thing I think about at 4 in the morning. She said, "Pop, if I tell you what else I saw, my dad goes to prison." She said, "Do you understand what you are asking me to do? And I want to tell you something, and I want to be honest, because this is not a story about a clever old man. This is a story about what things cost. I did not tell her it was fine. I did not tell her it would all work out. I did not tell her that her father deserved it, even though he did. I sat across from my granddaughter in my kitchen, and I said this, "Paige, I am 71 years old. In a few years, I am going to be dead, and you are going to be somewhere around 50, and you are going to be sitting in a kitchen very much like this one." And I said, "Whatever you do right now, you are going to be sitting with it then." And I said, "So do not do the thing that is easy, and do not do the thing I want. Do the thing you can live with at 71. And Paige Marsh sat in my kitchen for 4 full minutes without saying anything. And then she picked up her phone, and she opened it, and she turned it around, and she showed me a screenshot of a text message thread between her mother and her brother, dated the 4th of December, at 11:22 at night. Her mother had written, "Send the card version without him. Wesley needs it for the file by Monday." And Ethan had written back, 1 minute later, "Already done. Nobody looks at the edges. Nobody looks at the edges." I read it 3 times, and then I looked up at my granddaughter, and I am not a demonstrative man, and I have not said this to more than 4 people in my entire life, and I said it to her. I said, "Paige, I am so proud of you that I can hardly breathe." And she put her head down on my kitchen table, and she sobbed like a child. And I sat there, with my hand on her hair, and I looked past her, out the kitchen window, at the porch where my wife had put a camera on a fence post for 41 years. The porch where they had taken a photograph and cut me out of it. The porch that had a black camera above the door, recording 20 feet of audio, that a 19-year-old girl had asked me to install 4 days after her grandmother's funeral. They had cropped me out of the porch, so the porch was going to have to speak for me. They came on Saturday, the 7th of February, at 20 minutes to 10 in the morning. I knew they were coming, because on the 4th Priscilla had called me and told me, in her softest voice, that some people from the bank were going to stop by with a few papers, and that I did not have to worry about any of it, and that all I had to do was sign my name. She said, "It is just housekeeping, Dad." And I said, "All right, dear." And then I hung up the telephone, and I called Elena Cruz, and I told her, and I asked her what I should do. And Elena Cruz said something to me that I would like everybody watching this to write down. She said, "Sign it." I said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "Mr. Marsh, listen to me. They have a doctor's letter that says you are incapacitated. That letter is the only reason they can use the power of attorney, and now they want your signature on a deed." She said, "Do you see it?" And I sat down on my kitchen chair, because I did see it. They needed me incompetent to use the power of attorney, and they needed me competent to sign the deed. They could not have both. They could not have both, and they had been so busy building two separate machines that they had never once put them in the same room and looked at them. Elena Cruz said, "Every signature they take from a man they are calling incapacitated is a brick they are handing you. So sign everything. Sign it in front of a notary, sign it slowly. And for the love of God, Mr. Marsh, make sure that notary asks you if you understand what you are signing." And I said, "And if she asks?" And Elena Cruz said, "Tell her the truth." So on the 7th of February, at 9:30 in the morning, I sat in my living room in the gray cardigan, with the television on too loud, in full view of a camera on my own bookshelf, and I waited. 2 cars pulled into my driveway at 9:40, and they did not come in. They stood on the porch. I want you to picture it, because I did not have to picture it. I could hear every word. My house was built in 1938. The front door is oak. There is a mail slot in it, and the brush behind that mail slot fell out in about 2014, and Rosalind asked me to fix it 11 times, and I never did, and it is the single greatest failure of home maintenance in the history of Pennsylvania, and it saved my entire life. And above that door, at a height of about 7 feet, there was a small black camera that a 19-year-old girl had asked me to install, 4 days after her grandmother's funeral. They stood on my porch for 19 minutes and 40 seconds, waiting for a notary, in the cold, and I stood behind my own front door, with my hand flat on the oak, and I listened, and I did not move, and I did not breathe hard, and I have never in my life been so completely still. Priscilla spoke first. She said, her voice crisp and impatient in a way I had never heard, "She is late." I told her 10, and she is going to be late, Marcus said, in the voice of a man who wants very badly for something to be over. "Prissy, it is 9:40, and Priscilla said, "Do not call me that." There was a pause, and then Wesley Hargrove said, and I knew his voice instantly. That big, warm salesman's voice with a crack running through the middle of it now. "Priscilla, I want to say something, and I want to say it once." She said, "Say it." He said, "I should not be here. Do you understand that? A private client advisor does not attend a residential closing at the borrower's home. That is not a thing that happens. If anybody at Sentinel finds out I stood on this porch," and Priscilla cut him off, and her voice went completely flat. She said, "Wesley, you took $24,000. Silence. $24,000. I stood behind my door, and I put that number in my head, and I turned it over like a stone." He said, quietly, "That was a referral fee." And Priscilla said, in a tone of genuine, delighted contempt, "Call it whatever you want. It came out of the draw, it went into your account, and if you want to explain the difference to a jury, be my guest." And Wesley Hargrove said nothing. Because there is no difference. There has never been a difference. A bank officer who takes a payment out of the proceeds of a loan he originated has committed a federal crime, and there is a specific statute for it. And it does not have a nice name. Then my grandson spoke. Ethan said, cheerfully, "Are we doing this?" Or are we standing out here freezing? And Priscilla said, "We are doing it." And then she started to go through it, out loud, on my porch, in the cold, the way a woman goes through a list on her way to the grocery store. She said, "The deed goes into the trust today. Marcus is the trustee. Once it is in the trust, the house is not his anymore. It is an asset of the trust, and we can list it in April without one single signature from him," she said. "Wesley, the draw is at 310. We have spent 84. 60 went into the earnest money at the lake. 24 went to you. That leaves 226 sitting in the line. And I want all of it out before we list, because I do not want a bank looking at a payoff statement with a live balance on it." She said, "The house appraises at 610. Say we get 590. Pay off the 310, pay the realtor, and we net roughly 240, plus what is left in the draw, plus the accounts." And Marcus said, in a voice so small I almost did not hear it through the door, "And what about Dad?" And Priscilla said, "Cedar Hollow." She said, "I already toured it. Memory care wing. $4,200 a month. They have a whole activity schedule. It is very nice, Marcus. There is a bird room. There is a bird room. I stood behind my own front door in a cardigan my wife bought me for $22, and I listened to my daughter-in-law describe the room where I was going to die, and she said there was a bird room, and she said it the way you say a thing you have practiced." And Marcus said, "Prissy, he is not that bad. He does the crossword." And there was a pause. And then Priscilla laughed. Not cruelly. "That is the thing I want you to understand." She did not laugh cruelly. She laughed the way you laugh at a slow child. She said, "Marcus, sweetheart, it does not matter what he is," she said. "It matters what the file says." And then she said it. She said, "We have a physician's certification. We have 10 months of contemporaneous care notes. We have a police wellness check in the log. We have a video of him failing to recognize his own grandson." And she said, "And he has not appeared in a family photograph in 2 years." And she said, "On paper, Marcus, your father has not been anywhere. On paper, your father has not been anywhere." I closed my eyes, and I leaned my forehead against the inside of my own front door. And then Ethan, my grandson, 24 years old, who made a stop-motion film with paper clips when he was 9 that his grandmother showed to children for a decade, said, "Well, except for the sleeve." Priscilla said, "What?" And Ethan said, "On the card. His hand is still on the rail. Bottom left. I was working at like 11 at night, and I did not tighten the box. And there was a silence on my porch that lasted maybe 4 seconds. And then Priscilla said, "Is it a problem?" And my grandson said, "Nah." He said, "Nobody looks at the edges." I have thought about that sentence more than any other sentence in my life, and I have thought about a great many sentences. He was right, you know. That is the terrible part. He was completely right. Nobody does look at the edges. Not banks, not judges, not families. The whole world reads the middle of the page and moves on. And everything that has ever been stolen in the history of human beings has been stolen from the margin, in small amounts, at the border of the frame, where the eye slides past. He was right about everybody. He was just wrong about one man. Because 38 years, 406 examinations, 3 federal referrals, and 1 Senate subcommittee had all been about exactly one thing. I looked at the edges. That is all I ever did. That is the entire content of my professional life. I looked at the edges, and the edges are where they lived, and they had cropped me out of a photograph and left 1 inch of my own hand in the frame and told each other that nobody would notice. I was still standing there, with my forehead on the door, when Wesley Hargrove said the thing that changed everything. He said, and his voice was very tight now, "Priscilla, this is the 2nd time." Nobody said anything. He said, "I want to be extremely clear. This is the second time you have put me in a position where—" And Priscilla said, sharply, "Wesley!" And Ethan said, "Second time." And Priscilla said, in a voice like a knife going into a table, "Ethan, go start the car!" And I heard my grandson's footsteps go down my porch steps, all three of them, including the third one that sags in August. And then Marcus said, and I could hear that he was crying, and he is 49 years old, "Prissy, Mom would have—" And Priscilla said, "Your mother knew." Silence. 3 words. Your mother knew. I stood behind my front door, and I felt the entire floor of the world go out from under me. And then a car came up the street, and Priscilla said, brightly, "Here she is." And I heard her put on her face, the way another woman puts on a coat, and somebody knocked on my door. I want to tell you about the next 14 minutes, because they are the most difficult 14 minutes of my entire life, and I would not trade them for anything. Her name was Bernice Kwan. She was a notary public, and she was about 60, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she was completely, magnificently, gloriously by the book. She sat down at my dining room table. She opened a leather journal with numbered lines in it. She asked for my driver's license, and she wrote down the number and the expiration, and she compared the photograph to my face for a good 4 seconds, which is 4 seconds longer than most people ever look at me anymore. Priscilla sat on my left. Marcus stood by the window with his back to the room. Wesley Hargrove stood near the door with his coat still on. And Bernice Kwan put the deed in front of me, and she turned it so that it faced me, and she said, in a clear, flat, professional voice, "Mr. Marsh, before you sign, I have to ask you 3 questions." Priscilla shifted slightly in her chair. Bernice Kwan said, "Do you understand that this document transfers the property at 42 Larkspur Lane into the Marsh Family Legacy Trust?" And I looked at that document, and I want you to understand that I had spent my entire life reading documents. I read that deed in about 11 seconds. I read the trust name, and the trustee designation, and the recording instructions, and I saw that they had left the reserved life estate blank, which meant that on the day that deed was recorded, I would have no legal right to sleep in my own bed. And I looked up, and I looked across my own dining room table, past a notary public, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, at my daughter-in-law, and I said, in a clear and steady voice, "Yes, I understand it completely." Priscilla smiled at me. It was, I think, the warmest smile she has ever given me. Bernice Kwan said, "Are you signing this document of your own free will, without coercion?" And I said, "I am." And Bernice Kwan said, "Do you have any questions about what you are signing?" And I said, "No, ma'am, not one." And I picked up the pen, and I signed my name, Theodore A. Marsh, in the handwriting I have had since 1968, firm and legible, the same signature that is on the signature card in the vault of that bank, the signature that did not match the one on their closing package. And then Bernice Kwan turned her journal around and asked me to sign that too, on line 411, and to print the date and the time, 9:58 in the morning, February 7th, 2026. And she stamped it, and she wrote her own commission number, and she closed the book. And that book, that leather journal with numbered lines, went home with Bernice Kwan and sat in a fireproof box in a spare bedroom in Wescosville, Pennsylvania, for the next 11 weeks. It was, in the end, the single most damaging document in the case, because you cannot walk into a courtroom and tell a judge that a man has no idea what year it is, and then hand her a notarized journal in which that same man, 4 weeks after your doctor's letter, sat at his own dining room table and told a notary public, in front of 3 witnesses, that he understood the document completely. They took my house that morning, and I let them. And when they were gone, when the 2 cars had backed down my driveway, and the storm door had made the sound it makes when somebody is only visiting. I stood in my empty dining room for a while, and then I went upstairs, because there was a sentence sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone, and it had been sitting there for about 40 minutes, and I could not carry it one step further. Your mother knew. I went upstairs, and I turned left, and I walked past 41 photographs on a wall. And I opened the door of my wife's bedroom for the first time in 11 months. The room smelled like her. 11 months, and it still smelled like her. And I stood in the doorway for a long time before I could make myself walk in. Everything was exactly where she had left it. The reading glasses on the nightstand, folded, the water glass. The bookmark she had been using, which was a Brookfield Middle School library card, with a lion, printed on it in gold, faded almost to nothing from 40 years of being carried in a pocket. And a book. It was a hardcover, and it was old, and the spine was taped, and it was face down on the nightstand, with the bookmark still in it, at page 94. It was a library book. There was a pocket glued inside the back cover, and a card in the pocket, and on the card, in the stamped purple ink of a machine that has been in that school since 1971, was a due date, March 4th, 2025. My wife died on the 22nd of February. She had checked out a book from her own library, from the shelf of old books she refused to let the district digitize, and she had never returned it, and it had been sitting on her nightstand, accruing a fine of 10 cents a day for 11 months. I picked it up, and an envelope fell out of it. It was sealed. It had my name on it. Theo, just that, in her handwriting, in the blue felt-tip pen she bought by the box, and I sat down on my wife's side of the bed, on the 7th of February, 2026, 40 minutes after I signed my house away, to a woman who had told my son there was a bird room, and I opened it. I am going to read you some of it. Not all of it. Some of it is mine. She wrote, Theo, if you are reading this, you finally went into my room, which means it has been a while. I am sorry about that, and I am also a little bit glad, because it means you managed without me longer than I thought you would. I have to tell you something. And I am a coward, so I am telling you like this. The money is gone. My money. The money from my mother. The teacher's pension survivor account. The $411,000 that was in the account at Sentinel, with the 47 at the end. Marcus took it. He has been taking it since March of last year. I do not think he meant to, at first, and I know that sounds like the stupidest sentence a mother has ever written, and I am going to leave it in anyway, because it is true, and because you always said, the truth is the only thing worth writing down. I found it in July. I was not looking. I was reconciling the statements, because it was something to do that was not being sick. And then she wrote a line, and I have not been able to get it out of my head from that day to this one. She wrote, Theo, I did not say no to Philadelphia because of the highway. I said no, because in September I called Marcus and asked him to move $46,000 out of my account for the trial, and he told me it was tied up. And I hung up the telephone, and I got out the statements, and it was not tied up. It was gone. And I sat in the kitchen, and I understood that if I told you, you would look at me the way you looked at your brother at your mother's funeral, and then you would go quiet, and then you would spend the last 4 months of my life destroying our son. And I did not want to spend my last 4 months watching that. So I said no to Philadelphia, and I told you it was the highway. And you believed me, because you are a good man, and because you have never once in 43 years thought that I would lie to you. I am so sorry, my love. I want you to know that I do not think I would have lived anyway. That is what the doctor said, and I made him say it twice, and he was not a man who softened things. Please do not do arithmetic about this. Please. But I want you to know that I chose you, and I chose him, and I chose wrong, And I have known it was wrong for 5 months, and now it is February, and my hands do not work very well, and I am writing this in a book, because if I put it in a drawer, you will find it in a week. You will find it in this book when you are ready to be in this room, not before. I did one thing. I did the only thing I know how to do. I catalogued it. It is in the closet, behind the winter coats, in a folder. Theo, please, do not become a small man about this. Be what you are. I stopped reading there. I sat on the edge of my wife's bed with a piece of paper in my hands, and I did not make a sound. And I want to be honest with you, because if I lie to you now, then none of the rest of this is worth anything. I broke, not loudly. There was nobody in the house to hear it, and I would not have made a noise anyway, because I have never made a noise in my life. But I sat on that bed for something like 2 hours, and when I stood up, my legs did not work properly, and I had to hold the door frame. I want to say one thing to the people watching this who are my age. We are told, constantly, that the great tragedy of getting older is the losing. Losing your friends, losing your hearing, losing your car keys. God help us. That is not the great tragedy. The great tragedy is finding out that somebody you loved spent the last months of their life protecting you from something, and did it alone, and died with it. Rosalind Marsh sat in our kitchen in September of 2024 with a piece of paper that said her own son had taken her money, and she looked out the window at me raking leaves, and she decided that she would rather die than tell me. That is what they did. Not the house, not the $310,000, not the bird room. That. I went to the closet, behind the winter coats, on the floor, underneath a box of Christmas ornaments. There was a manila folder, and on the tab, in her handwriting, in the blue felt tip, R. Marsh, Act 44-117. I took it downstairs to my kitchen table, and I put on my glasses, and I opened it, and I sat there until it got dark, and I did not turn a light on until I was finished. I have examined 406 financial institutions. It was the best working file I have ever seen in my life. Every monthly statement, from March of 2024 to February of 2025, 12 of them, each one in order, each one with the date she received it, written in the top right corner, because that is what you do when you are a librarian, and you have spent 40 years teaching 11-year-olds that a record without a date is a rumor, and every withdrawal highlighted in yellow. And beside every highlighted withdrawal, in the margin, in pencil, in a hand that got shakier, month by month, until by February, you could barely read it, the amount, written out again, and the date, and a question mark, 26 withdrawals. $9,400, $8,800, $9,600, $9,250, $8,900, $9,700, 26 of them over 11 months, totaling $217,000. And not one single one of them was $10,000 or more. Not one. And on the statement from August of 2024, in the margin, next to a highlighted line, my wife had written 5 words in pencil. She wrote, "Always under 10." Why always under 10? She did not know. She did not know, and it bothered her. And so she wrote it down, because strange things should be written down. That is all she was doing. A 69-year-old woman with cancer, sitting at a kitchen table, noticing a pattern she could not explain, and doing the only thing her whole life had trained her to do about a thing she could not explain. She wrote it down. And 11 months after she died, a retired bank examiner sat at that same kitchen table and read it, and he knew exactly why. Because $10,000 is the number. Any cash transaction of $10,000 or more at a federally insured bank in the United States generates something called a currency transaction report. It is automatic. It goes to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Nobody at the branch can turn it off, and nobody at the branch can pretend it did not happen. And deliberately breaking a large withdrawal into smaller pieces to stay under that number is not a clever trick. It is a federal felony. It has its own statute. It is called structuring, and it does not matter one bit whether the underlying money was stolen. The act of structuring is the crime, all by itself, 26 times. 26 times. In 11 months, somebody had walked into the Sentinel Trust branch on Delaware Avenue with a durable power of attorney that was not yet valid, and pulled cash out of a dying woman's account, and stayed under $10,000 every single time, and a teller cannot process that. Not repeatedly, not from the same account. The core system flags it. It flags it automatically, and it kicks the transaction to an officer for override. So I went through the folder again, slowly, and I found what I was looking for on the 11th page. She had photocopied the withdrawal slips. Of course she had. But she had gone into that branch and requested copies of her own withdrawal slips, and she had paid $2 a page for them, and there was a receipt for $48 stapled to the back of the folder. And in the bottom right corner of every single slip, in the officer override box, there were two initials, W.H. 26 times, W.H. I sat in my dark kitchen at 10 o'clock at night on the 7th of February, and I laid 26 photocopies out on the table in 6 rows, the way I had laid 412 of them on a conference table in Erie in 1991. And I looked at them for a long, long time. And then I got up, and I went out onto my porch, without a coat, in February, and I sat down on the top step where a doctor had stood 3 weeks earlier and asked what he should write about me. It was very cold and very quiet, and I said, out loud, to my street, "Rose, you should have told me." And then I said, "Rose, I am not going to become a small man about this." And I sat there until I could not feel my hands. Now, here is what my wife's folder did, and I want to explain it precisely, because it is the entire reason my son is in a federal prison and not in a family therapy session. Up until the 7th of February, what I had was a bad story about a family. I had a fraudulent home equity loan. I had a doctor who did not do his job. I had a forged notebook and a doctored video, and a woman who wanted a house. It was ugly, and it was criminal. And honestly, a good lawyer might have made a jury believe that a grieving man had signed things he did not remember signing, and that his family had acted, however clumsily, in what they believed were his interests. That is what family cases turn into. Every single time. They turn into a fog. My wife's folder burned the fog off, because $217,000, taken in 26 structured cash withdrawals across 11 months, overridden every single time by the same bank officer, out of the account of a woman dying of pancreatic cancer, is not a family dispute. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a pattern. And a pattern, in a federal courtroom, is another word for conspiracy. They had not made one mistake. They had made 26 of them, and then a 27th, and every one of them had a date and a time and a set of initials, and my wife had put them all in a folder and labeled it in blue felt-tip pen and hidden it behind the winter coats. I called Frank Delgado at 7 in the morning on the 8th of February. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had not been sleeping either. I said, "Frank, it is not one loan." And he said, "Ted, I know." And I said, "What do you mean you know?" And Frank Delgado said, "We pulled the telephone recordings." I sat down. He said, "Ted, on the 3rd of December, at 2:41 in the afternoon, Wesley Hargrove took a call at his desk, on his desk phone, on the bank's platform. He said, "Do you know what that means?" And I said, "Yes." I said it very quietly, and I put my hand over my eyes, and I said, "Yes." Because I did know what that means. I have known what that means since 1982. Every telephone call made or received on a bank's recorded line is captured. All of it. It is not optional, and it is not a secret, and it is written into every compliance manual in the industry, and there is a sticker on the handset. Those recordings are retained for years, and they are the property of the institution. And when a customer sends a certified letter demanding preservation of all records, including telephone recordings, and a federal examiner walks in the door 8 weeks later with a document request, they do not go missing. They get printed out. Wesley Hargrove spent his entire career on that telephone. It was the most important object in his life. It was how he closed. It was how he charmed. It was how a senior private client advisor, with a putter behind a plant, made himself feel important. And on the 3rd of December, at 2:41 in the afternoon, my daughter-in-law called Wesley Hargrove on that telephone, and she talked to him for 19 minutes. Frank Delgado said, "Ted, I am not permitted to play it for you." And then he said, in a very careful voice, "But she uses your wife's name." I sat in my kitchen, and I said, "Frank, when do you go in?" And he said, "We are already in." He said, "2 examiners walked into the Delaware Avenue branch at 8 o'clock this morning, and a document preservation order went to the holding company at 8:04. And Wesley Hargrove is currently sitting in his own conference room with the head of compliance. And Ted, listen to me. You cannot tell anybody. Not your lawyer, not your granddaughter, nobody. Because there is a hearing coming." And I said, "What hearing?" And Frank Delgado said, "You do not know?" He said, "Ted, they filed on Thursday." He said, "Orphans Court, Brookfield County, petition for adjudication of incapacity and appointment of a guardian of the person and the estate." He said, "Your son is asking a judge to declare you legally incapacitated." He said, "It is on the calendar for the 24th of February, and I sat there at my kitchen table with 26 photocopies laid out in front of me in 6 rows. The 24th of February. 2 days after the anniversary of the morning my wife died. They were going to erase me on paper, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, and they were going to do it 2 days after the anniversary of Rosalind's death. And I looked out my kitchen window at my porch, and I said, to Frank Delgado, and to my empty house, and to the woman who had spent the last 5 months of her life protecting a man who did not want protecting, "Good, let them file it. Let them walk into a courtroom. Let them stand up in front of a judge, under oath, on the record, with a court reporter typing every word, and let them say all of it out loud. Because in 38 years, do you know what I could never get? A confession. They were about to give me one, under oath, in public, and they were going to bring the photograph with them. The Orphans Court of Brookfield County sits on the 3rd floor of a limestone building on Court Street that was built in 1929. The radiators knock, the benches are oak, and they are hard, and they have been polished by 70 years of the backsides of people having the worst day of their lives. I arrived at 8:50 on the morning of the 24th of February, 2026. I wore the gray cardigan. I want to tell you what was in the left pocket of that cardigan, because it was the only thing I brought with me that morning that was not evidence. It was a Brookfield Middle School library card, from the old pocket and card system, with a gold lion printed on it, faded almost to nothing after 40 years of being carried around in the apron of a 5'1" woman who knew every child in that building. My wife's bookmark. I put it in my pocket at 7 in the morning, and I did not tell anybody, and I never took it out. They were already there when I came in. Marcus, in a suit he had bought for a funeral. Priscilla, in navy, with a legal pad. Ethan, on his phone. And at the council table, Doug Prentice, who had drawn up my will in 1994 and had eaten dinner in my house on at least 9 occasions. He did not look at me. Paige sat in the back row, alone on the left. She was wearing her grandmother's coat, which is a coat I had not seen since 2024, and which she had taken out of my closet 3 weeks earlier, without asking, and I had watched her do it from the kitchen doorway, and I had not said a word. I sat down next to Elena Cruz. Nobody paid any attention to her. She had a plain black folder and a cheap pen, and she looked, in that room, like exactly what everybody assumed she was, which was a court-appointed formality. At 9:30, the Honorable Miriam Vance came in. She is 66 years old, and she has been on that bench for 31 years, and she has the flattest, most unimpressed face I have ever seen on a human being, and I liked her immediately, for the same reason I liked Elena Cruz. Doug Prentice stood up, and he made his case, and I am going to tell you honestly that it was a good one. He was calm. He was regretful. He was, in his words, deeply reluctant to be here at all. He put Dr. Alan Halloran on the stand, and Dr. Halloran raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. And then he sat down, and he said that, in his professional medical opinion, Theodore A. Marsh suffered from a progressive cognitive impairment that rendered him unable to manage his financial affairs. Elena Cruz did not object. Elena Cruz did not write anything down. Then he put Priscilla on the stand. And my daughter-in-law was magnificent. I have to say it. She was absolutely magnificent. She cried at the right moment. She held the composition notebook in both hands like it was a bird. She said, in a voice that shook exactly the correct amount, "Your Honor, I did not want to do this. He is my husband's father, but we have watched him disappear." And she read from the notebook. She read the entry about the stove. She read the entry about the freezer. She read the wellness check. And then she read the last one. She said, "Thanksgiving." He did not participate in the family photograph. He withdrew to the house. He did not speak to his grandchildren. And Doug Prentice said, "Your Honor, we would like to introduce Petitioner's Exhibit 9. And he handed up a Christmas card. Cream-colored, heavy stock, our porch. Marcus, Priscilla, Ethan, Paige, and an empty chair, with a red cardigan on the back of it, and nobody on the left. Judge Vance looked at it for about 6 seconds and set it down. Doug Prentice said, "No further questions." And Judge Miriam Vance looked over her glasses at our table, and she said, in a voice of complete boredom, "Counsel, anything?" And Elena Cruz stood up and said, "Yes, Your Honor, 2 witnesses." And Doug Prentice looked up. She called Bernice Kwan. Bernice Kwan came in with her leather journal in a plastic bag, and she sat down, and she put on her reading glasses on their beaded chain, and Elena Cruz asked her 4 questions. "Did you notarize a deed transferring 42 Larkspur Lane into the Marsh Family Legacy Trust?" "I did." "On what date?" "February 7th, 2026, at 9:58 in the morning." "Did you, as required, ask the signer whether he understood the document?" "I did." "What did he say?" And Bernice Kwan looked at her journal, and she read it out loud, in a flat, professional voice, from line 411. He said, "Yes, I understand it completely." There was a silence in that courtroom, and Elena Cruz said, "Mrs. Kwan, one more thing. Who else was present in the room?" And Bernice Kwan said, "The petitioner, Mrs. Priscilla Marsh, Mr. Marcus Marsh, and a gentleman from the bank." Elena Cruz said, "Did any of them, at any point, tell you that Mr. Marsh had been certified as incapacitated by a physician 4 weeks earlier?" And Bernice Kwan said, in a voice that had gone suddenly very quietly cold. No, they did not. Judge Vance took her glasses off, and she looked at Doug Prentice for a long, long moment. And Doug Prentice did not look back. And then Elena Cruz said, "Your Honor, my second witness is my client, and he would like to address the court himself." And Priscilla, at the petitioner's table, turned around and looked at me, and I stood up. 71 years old, Fav gray cardigan, left pocket. I want to tell you what it feels like, after 11 months of being a piece of furniture, to stand up in a room, in front of the people who moved you to the garage. It does not feel like triumph. It feels like putting down something extraordinarily heavy that you have been carrying so long that you had stopped noticing your own arms. I did not raise my voice. I have never raised my voice. I said, "Your Honor, my name is Theodore Allen Marsh. I am 71 years old. For 38 years, I was a national bank examiner with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and I retired in 2018 at the grade of examiner in charge." I said, "I have 3 things to hand up to the court." And Doug Prentice said, "Your Honor, this is highly," and Judge Miriam Vance said, one word, without even turning her head, "Sit." He sat. I said, "The first thing is Petitioner's Exhibit 9. I said, "The photograph on that card was taken on my front porch on the 27th of November, 2025, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, on a camera resting on a fence post, as it has been every Thanksgiving since 1985. I said, "Your Honor, that photograph has been cropped," and I handed the bailiff a single sheet of paper, and he carried it up, and Judge Vance took it. It was the original, uncropped, full frame, printed on 8.5 by 11 paper, at 300 dots per inch, with the metadata block printed along the bottom margin. Date taken, time taken, camera model, original file dimensions, and the export log from a machine registered to Ethan Marsh, showing the edited version created on the 4th of December at 11:19 at night, and in that photograph, there were 5 people and a chair, and on the far left, in a gray cardigan, with his right hand on the porch rail, standing exactly where he had stood for 41 years, was me. And Judge Miriam Vance looked at that photograph for a very long time. The radiator knocked twice, and then she looked up, and she did not look at me. She looked at the witness stand, and she said, "Mrs. Marsh, you are still under oath." And Priscilla said, in a voice that had gone very thin, "Yes, Your Honor." And Judge Miriam Vance held up that piece of paper, and turned it around so the whole courtroom could see it, and she said, "Who is that man on the left?" And my daughter-in-law opened her mouth, and nothing came out. I have thought about that silence every single day since. It lasted 11 seconds. I counted them, because I am the kind of man who counts things, and because I had waited 11 months for 11 seconds. And then I said, "Your Honor, the second thing is a video file, and I would ask the court's permission to play it." And Judge Vance said, without taking her eyes off Priscilla, "Play it." It was 71 seconds long. It was gray, and it was grainy, and it had a timestamp burned into the corner of the frame, and it was recorded by a $189 camera above a door in a house built in 1938, and it played on a courtroom monitor in front of 40 people. And in it, Dr. Alan Halloran, in a very good overcoat, standing on my top step, said, "I can have the certification to you by Friday." And my daughter-in-law said, "Friday is too late. Wesley needs it Wednesday." And Dr. Alan Halloran laughed, and he said, "Send me the intake sheet, and I will match the language." I watched Dr. Halloran's face in that courtroom while his own voice came out of the speakers. I watched a 63-year-old physician's entire professional life end in 71 seconds, and I did not enjoy it, and I did not look away. And then I said, "Your Honor, the third thing is not mine," and I put a manila folder on the rail in front of the bailiff. And I said, my voice absolutely steady, because I had practiced this sentence in my kitchen 40 times. That folder was assembled between March of 2024 and February of 2025 by my wife, Rosalind Marsh, who was the librarian at Brookfield Middle School for 40 years, while she was dying of pancreatic cancer. I said, it contains 12 monthly statements from Sentinel Trust account number ending 4417, 26 photocopied withdrawal slips, and a receipt for $48, which is what the bank charged her to copy the evidence of her own robbery. I said, every withdrawal in that folder is under $10,000. There are 26 of them. They total $217,000. Every one of them bears the same officer override initials. And I said, Your Honor, my wife did not know what that meant. And I said, and this is the only moment in the entire proceeding when my voice was not completely steady, but she wrote it down anyway. And that is when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. I did not turn around. I did not have to. I have sat in enough rooms in my life to know the sound of a federal agency arriving. It is not dramatic. Nobody shouts. It is the sound of 4 or 5 people in unremarkable coats, walking in a specific way. Frank Delgado came down the center aisle and stopped at the bar and handed a document to the bailiff. And behind him were 2 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation out of the Allentown Resident Agency, and an investigator from the Pennsylvania Department of Aging, and a woman from the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And behind all of them, in a cardigan, holding her handbag with both hands, 29 years old, terrified, having taken a personal day she could not afford, was Denise Alvarado. She had filed the escalation on the 23rd of December at 4:40 in the afternoon. She had copied everyone. And Judge Miriam Vance read the document the bailiff handed her, and she read it twice, and then she took off her glasses and she set them down on the bench. And she said, Mr. Prentice, your clients have asked this court to find that Theodore Marsh is unable to manage his own affairs. She said, I have been on this bench for 31 years. And she said, I have never seen a man manage his affairs better. She denied the petition from the bench. She voided the deed. She revoked the power of attorney. And she referred the physician's certification to the State Board of Medicine. And she ordered the entire record of the proceeding preserved and transmitted to the United States Attorney. And then she said, Mrs. Marsh, do not leave this courtroom. And they arrested Priscilla in the aisle, in navy, with her legal pad still on the table. They arrested Ethan in the hallway, on his phone. They arrested Dr. Alan Halloran in the parking garage, at his car, with the door open. And they had already arrested Wesley Hargrove at 11 o'clock that morning, in the conference room of the Delaware Avenue branch of Sentinel Trust Bank, in front of the head of compliance, 2 federal examiners, and a putter leaning in the corner behind a plant. They did not arrest my son. My son stood up, in a suit he bought for a funeral, in the middle of a courtroom in Brookfield, Pennsylvania. And he walked over to the 2 agents, and he put his wrists out, and he said, in a voice I had not heard since he was 8 years old, I did it. I took my mother's money. She was in a chair in the kitchen, and I took it. And then Marcus Marsh looked across that room at me, and I looked back at him, and I did not say anything at all. Here is the accounting. I am a man who closes his books. Priscilla Marsh pleaded guilty in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania to conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and financial exploitation of an older adult. She was sentenced to 11 years. Her credential was permanently revoked, and she is barred for life from any role in healthcare administration in this Commonwealth. She was the architect, and the judge said so out loud. Wesley Hargrove pleaded guilty to bank fraud, receipt of an unlawful commission by a bank officer, and making false entries in the records of a financial institution. He was sentenced to 9 years, and ordered to pay $410,000 in restitution. And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency issued a removal and prohibition order, which means Wesley Hargrove may never again work for any federally insured bank in the United States of America. Not as an officer, not as a teller, not as a janitor. He was so proud of that telephone. Dr. Alan Halloran lost his medical license, paid a $50,000 fine, and was sentenced to 2 years for healthcare fraud and conspiracy. 71 seconds on a doorstep. Ethan Marsh, my grandson, 24 years old, was sentenced to 4 years for wire fraud and fabrication of evidence, and ordered to pay $60,000. The software he used to build his lies kept a perfect log of every edit he ever made, with his name on it, because that is what software does. He had spent 4 years learning how to make an image tell a story. It took a jury 40 minutes to see through the only one that ever mattered. Marcus Marsh, my son, pleaded guilty and cooperated fully, and refused a deal that would have cut his time in half in exchange for testimony against his sister-in-law that he told them, flatly, would have been a lie. He was sentenced to 7 years and ordered to repay $217,000. I did not attend his sentencing. Denise Alvarado was promoted, and then, 4 months later, Frank Delgado hired her away. She is a national bank examiner now. She sat in my kitchen in July, and I told her, over tea that neither of us drank, that she was going to be very good at it, and that the entire job comes down to one thing. Look at the edges. The house was returned. The deed was voided. The lien was removed. And the $310,000 line of credit was extinguished as fraudulently originated. With the recovered funds, the asset forfeiture on the lake house, and the restitution, the total came to $741,000. Paige finished her sophomore year, and then she changed her major. She is studying social work now. She wants to work in elder protection. I am paying for every dollar of it, and she fought me about it for 2 hours in my kitchen, and she lost, because I am extremely stubborn, and she is only 19. On the 10th of October 2026, I stood in the library at Brookfield Middle School. The school district had cut the librarian position in 2023, 18 months before my wife retired, and they had kept her on as a part-time aide at $19 an hour because she would not leave the children. I did not know that. She never told me that either. So I gave them $250,000. It endows the Rosalind Marsh Reading Room and the Rosalind Marsh Literacy Fund, and it pays the salary of one full-time librarian at Brookfield Middle School for the next 20 years, which is longer than any child now living in this town will be a child. They restored the mural. The lion is gold again, lying in the tall grass with his eyes half open, the way he was in 1974. There were maybe 200 people in that room. A lot of them were 40 and 50 years old, and they had been failing readers once. And when the principal, Nora Whitlock, finished talking, I walked up to the circulation desk, and I put a book on it. It was a hardcover. The spine was taped. There was a card in the pocket in the back, with a purple stamp on it that said, March 4th, 2025. I said, I am returning this. It is late. And Nora Whitlock said, Mr. Marsh, please. And I said, Ma'am, the fine is 10 cents a day. It has been 585 days, and I counted it out on that desk, in front of 200 people, in cash, in ones and quarters and dimes, $58.50. And then I put the bookmark back in her book, the library card with the gold lion on it, and I put the book on the shelf myself, $250,000 and $58.50. She would have thought the second one was funnier. Marcus writes to me. He has written 11 letters. I did not open the first 10. I opened the 11th, in November, at my kitchen table, in the chair where she used to sit. It was one sentence long. It said, Dad, I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to tell me if she was afraid at the end. I sat with that for 4 days. And then I wrote back, and my letter was one sentence too. I wrote, she was not afraid, and she asked me not to become a small man, and you should know that I am trying. That is all. That is everything there is. I still live at 42 Larkspur Lane. The porch is still there. The camera is still above the door, and I have never once taken it down. Last Thanksgiving, Paige set the camera on the fence post, the way her grandmother did for 41 years. There were 2 of us in the photograph, and 1 empty chair. Nobody cropped anything. My grandson said that nobody looks at the edges. He was right about the world. The world reads the middle of the page, and it moves on, and everything that has ever been taken from an old man was taken from the margin, where the eye slides past. He was wrong about exactly one thing, because I spent 38 years reading the edges, and I will tell you what I learned in all that time. The edges always balance. An old lion does not roar. He reconciles the account. If this story found you today, do me one last favor. Leave a comment and tell me about the person who taught you to write things down, because somebody did, and they deserve to be named. Like this video, and subscribe to Old Lion Stories, and I will see you in the next one.